Begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for another opportunity to study your word, Father. Thank you for those that are present here today and for the encouragement that comes with assembling together. Father, we know there are those among us who are struggling in whatever way, Father. Pray that in the face of our struggles we might turn to you for comfort and strength and guidance, Father, and pray that those who are not with us might be able to be with us at the next time we gather together. Father, we also continue to pray for our country and everything that's going on in our country at this time. Pray that our leaders might make decisions that are in accordance with your will. And help us have clear minds and hearts as we prepare to enter into this study, Father. And it's your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Mark chapter 14. That's Mark chapter 14. I will get there myself. Well, as I was looking at this particular study, realized we've arrived. We have spent several months in Mark chapter 14, a very long chapter, and we finally have arrived at the end of it in our study tonight, verses 66 through 72. What are we dealing with here in Mark 14? What have we been dealing with? Things leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus. It's all those events that are leading up to it. We've looked at what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas has carried out his betrayal. They came to arrest him. Jesus has been arrested at the point we're going to be looking at, but as Jesus was being led away after he was arrested, who was following? What was that? Peter. The Apostle Peter is following, and we learned that he was following, not only following, but following at a distance. He's keeping his distance away from Jesus as he's being led away to the beginning portions of his trial. So it's in that context that as we reach verses 66 through 72, we read one of the more familiar stories concerning the Apostle Peter, which is a story about how after Jesus' arrest and during this beginning portion of Jesus' trial, what did he do? What did Jesus predict he would do? That he would deny him. And now we've arrived at that moment, the story of Peter's denials. And it's this that we're going to spend time with as we more closely examine verses 66 through 72. Now, when we look at verses 66 through 72, I think this section breaks down very neatly because it does break down into each of Peter's three denials. And therefore, it makes up 3 points. Very scriptural. 3 points that we're going to be looking at tonight that all have to do with Peter's denials. Denial number 1 is verses 66 through 68, where we find that Peter, first of all, denied being with Jesus. Denial number 2, verses 69 and 70, Peter denied being a follower of Jesus. And finally, denial number 3, verses 71 and 72, Peter denied even knowing Jesus. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that it is possible to deny Jesus. Now, that in mind, let's read verses 66 through 72, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark 14, beginning in verse 66, the text says, "As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Nazarene.' But he denied it, saying, 'I neither know nor understand what you are talking about.' And he went out onto the porch. The servant girls saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, "This is one of them." But again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus made the remark to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep. So again, this is all about Peter's 3 denials. And that's how this section breaks down, is into those 3 denials. Denial number 1, verses 66 through 68, Peter denied being with Jesus. Now this point is introduced with Mark recording in verse 66, that as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. Now, just by way of review, where did Jesus go when he was arrested? What location? Anyone remember? It was kind of a small detail, but okay, Peter's in the courtyard. Where's Jesus? In the house. Yeah, Dina is trying to say it. Yes, in the house. Jesus is inside the home of the high priest. That's where at least the beginning portions of his trial are taking place. Where's Peter? In the courtyard. Well, the text says below in the courtyard. We need to notice that. Now, as Peter's there, who comes along? One of the servant girls. Servant girls of who? The high priest. Okay, so these are the elements of this verse that we have. This is one of those stage setting verses for what Mark's going to go on to record. So he's telling us where Peter was, below in the courtyard. This tells us that this courtyard was somewhere below the main portion of the high priest's house. And something else we should know about this courtyard is people were allowed to gather there. It was a place where people commonly gathered together. But then we have this servant girl. We've already said he's a servant girl of the high priest. More specifically, a slave is the language that is used here. And at this time, the high priest, given his position in society, he would have servants like this. He'd have slaves, people serving him. But it's this female servant who confronts Peter. And anything else on verse 66 before we go to 67? Okay. So go on to verse 67. The servant girl shows up. What's Peter doing in verse 67? He's warming himself. And then what does the servant girl do? Okay, what's implied by that statement, that the servant girl makes this statement? What does she figure out about Peter, in other words? Other than the obvious. Okay, but how does she recognize him, I guess is a better question to ask. He was with Jesus, but what's Peter doing when she makes this statement? He's warming himself. How would he be warming himself at this time? What? Next to a fire. Now, when you're standing next to a fire, what does that do as far as to your face? What's that? It illuminates it. That's probably why Mark includes this detail about Peter warming himself, because what's the scene here is probably his face is lighting up because he's standing next to a fire. This servant girl looks at him and she says, you were also with Jesus the Nazarene. Does that make sense? Okay. Now again, I'm just offering some possibilities here, but this servant girl is obviously she's looking at everybody, but she notices Peter and sees him as having been with Jesus the Nazarene. That's how Jesus is identified. Now, we've run into identifications of Jesus in this way, where he's identified Jesus as Jesus the Nazarene. Why, can anyone remind me why he's called Jesus the Nazarene in some passages like this one, instead of just Jesus? Jesus is a common name. Now that's been mentioned before. Now the name Jesus, you might already know this, but the name Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew Joshua, like the Old Testament book of Joshua. So in the Greek form, Jesus was a common name. You might say, well, I just saw Jesus. Well, which Jesus? Mark identifies him as Jesus the Nazarene. Now what does the Nazarene mean, or where does that name come from? Nazareth, where he was from. So you might say, well, I just saw Jesus. Okay, which Jesus? There's a whole bunch of Jesuses here. Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus from Nazareth. So this is how the servant girl identifies Peter, as being with that Jesus, the Jesus from Nazareth that everybody knew of at this point. Anything else on verse 67? So now we come to, well, lack of a better term, the climax. How does Peter respond to this statement? What does the text say? Okay, but what does Mark record first before he denied it? What did he deny? That he was with him. Now, can anyone tell me what that word denied means in this context? Oh, I disagree with her statement. Okay, any other thoughts on denied? What does it mean to deny something? Maybe he did lie in this statement, but when you deny something, what are you doing? You're not acknowledging something. More specifically, this word has to do with declaring something that is untrue. So Mark uses the word to say that Peter declared it. Yes, he did lie, but the point here is that Peter declared it to be untrue that he had been with Jesus. But he adds to that, I don't understand what you're talking about. He claimed to not be aware of what this servant girl was talking about. But what else does he do after he makes this statement? He went out to the porch. I will talk about this porch in just a minute. But what was he attempting to do after he's confronted with his relationship with Jesus? Get away from the fire. He wants to get out of the situation. He basically escapes. Now, he was in the courtyard, but now he goes out to this porch. So we have to ask, well, what's this porch about? This porch is the area immediately outside of the courtyard. So he's still, for lack of a better term, on the property of the high priest. But now he moves from the courtyard to the porch because he didn't like being in this situation. He wants to get out of there. Anything else on verse 68? Okay. So this is denial number one. The point we should see from verses 66 through 68 concerning Peter's denials of Jesus is that Peter denied being with Jesus. In these verses, Mark has shown that the first denial of Peter was one where he denied being in the company of Jesus, just to put it in other words. Now, as we've seen, the manner in which Peter did this was by expressing that he was not aware of nor understood what the servant girl of these verses was talking about. Now, what Mark has also shown in these verses is that in denying Jesus, Peter also attempted to escape from those who were confronting him. Now that brings us into denial number 2, 69 and 70. Peter denied being a follower of Jesus. So Peter's gone out to the porch of this property. What happens in verse 69? Okay, so it's a similar situation. Now, when we read this verse, we might assume this is the same servant girl. But it's possible that it's not. Well, why not? Because if we were to read Matthew's account of this story, Matthew 26, verses 69 through 75, it's possible that this was a separate servant girl, because Matthew says another servant girl came along and does what Mark describes here. But that's just a side note. But this time she's not talking to Peter. Who's the servant girl talking to in this verse? To the bystanders. What are bystanders? What's idling? Other people milling around. Witnesses. It's not just Peter and the servant girl here. There's all kinds of people in this courtyard and on this porch. So now this servant girl, she's unnamed, says, this guy right here, he's one of them. One of who? What's that, Dina? One of the disciples or followers of Jesus. So now she's pointing out, everybody, this guy right here, he's one of the followers of Jesus. Not only adds to this statement from before that he was with Jesus, but now adding he was a follower of Jesus. Now, in addition to these things, something else we should understand here is that what Mark records here paints the picture that Peter is almost being followed in this case because he's been pointed out, he's been singled out. Anything else on verse 69? All right. So we reach verse 70. What does Peter do? He denied it again. Denial number 2. But now the bystanders are getting a little more aggressive. What do they say?
Surely you're one of them, for you are a Galilean too. And how'd they know that?
That's a good question, Don, and we're going to answer it.
Right, because I didn't know what was the way he dressed, or the accent, or what was going on with that.
That is an excellent question to ask of this verse. Yes, they do. Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too. So we've already dealt with the word denied. What's that? What did you say, Shannon? Now, where did you read that? Right here in Mark? Can you read your verse 70?
But he denied it again, and a little later those who stood by said to Peter again, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it.
You have, and your speech shows it. Elaine, you're nodding your head. Does yours say that?
Oh, mine doesn't have that.
Interesting. Mark, at least in the American Standard, does not include that information. But back in Matthew 26 that I referenced earlier, we do find that information. It was the way Peter spoke that gave him away as a Galilean. Now, so let's just talk a little bit about Galilee. If geographically speaking, where's Galilee in the land of Israel? Yeah, northern. Jerusalem's down in the south. Now, even here in the United States, depending on which part of the country you go to, people are going to speak differently. Now, Don, please, I hope you don't mind me using as an example. But we all know Don's from Tennessee. That's his home. You listen to Don, he speaks a little bit differently than people out here in Utah. And that's not just a little bit, not much. But that's because people in Tennessee speak differently than us. So if this were happening here, somebody's pointing out Don, you were one of them because you're from Tennessee too. Well, how would they know? The way he speaks. That's what gave Peter away as a Galilean, the way that he spoke. Now let's ask this question. Being that Peter was a Galilean, why would they reach this conclusion that he's a follower of Jesus? Where did Jesus spend most of his time? In Galilee. In our studies in Mark, the majority of our studies where Jesus has been is up in Galilee. It's only now that we're beginning to see Jesus do things down south, south.
So why does the New American Standard not have, and your speech shows it?
I don't know.
Well, that's kind of curious. I mean,
It is curious.
that's like a lot of words left out, if there were, from whatever they were using to translate it into English.
That is a curious thing. What translation are you reading, Shannon? New King James.
Well, I'll pull that up, New King James, on that verse, and
It does.
it does show that, but it's curious.
I don't know. Our translators are funny sometimes. I'll just.
That was an extremely important point.
And it's a point Matthew brings out, that at least as far as the New American Standard is concerned. And it's in Matthew 26:73, where we read that. But I don't know. I don't know why the New American Standard left it out and the New King James included it. I would have to go back to the Greek, I would have to go back and look at the Greek and see how the original Greek renders it. But excellent questions being asked of this verse here in verse 70. Anything else on verse 70?
Oh, just a comment. King James Version, just to kind of close the loop. Surely, the last part of it, surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. That's
That sounds like old King James.
well,
Yeah.
yeah. It is.
So
So, interesting.
that is interesting.
Plot thickens.
The plot thickens indeed. So anyway, that goes back to Don's question and answers this is why they knew he was a Galilean, because of the way that he spoke. Anything else on 70? Okay. So this is denial number 2. Verses 69 and 70, Peter denied being a follower of Jesus. Now in these verses, Mark has shown that another thing Peter denied about his relationship with Jesus was the fact that he denied following Jesus. Even though this is the case, the bystanders mentioned in these verses knew that Peter had to be a follower of Jesus because of who he was as a Galilean. And so even though Peter denied being a follower of Jesus, he could not escape the accusation that he was a follower of Jesus simply because of where he was from. So that brings us into denial number 3, verses 71 and 72. We find another response from Peter there beginning in verse 71. He's already been accused and denied a second time, but now he denies a third time. The word denied is not used in verse 71, but what does Peter do? He curses and swears. What does he say? I do not know this man of who you speak, or New American Standard, I do not know this man you are talking about. But first, Mark tells us he curses and swears. Now, what does the word curse mean? Okay. That is what he's doing. Cursing here is, he's not saying cuss words. That's not what cursing here has to do with.
Found under an oath is what I have as a definition.
But we'll get to the oath aspect of this in a minute. But first he cursed. That is the idea of him calling curses on himself. Now, why would he do that?
Emphasize, kind of strengthen his point that he didn't know Jesus.
That's
That's
what.
why he would do it. They
That-
might tend to believe him more.
That is that's part of what's going on here. He's under pressure for being associated with this man who's just been arrested. And so he's calling curses on himself to emphasize that point, as untrue as it is, to emphasize that point, that he has nothing to do with Jesus. But he's also swearing. Now, Don, yours said invoking an oath. Is
Well,
that?
I didn't say that. It just occurred.
Oh,
I was
you.
just looking at the definition.
Okay, yeah, that's what swearing is. Now, when you swear to something, what are you doing? You're taking, yes, that's what, okay, so yes, that's one way to define it, making an oath. He's standing by the fact that he has no relationship with Jesus. And he makes a statement, I do not know this man you are talking about, I swear. That's what he's doing. And Matthew confirms that for us. Matthew 26, verse 72. Matthew says that Peter denied his relationship with Jesus with an oath. Matthew uses those words. And then again in verse 74 of that chapter, Matthew also records that Peter began to curse and swear. And that's when he made that statement that we read here. So since that's true, something else we should understand here is that when Peter says what he says here, he's claiming he does not know who Jesus is. Now, when you say you don't know someone, what does that mean? You don't know him? Okay. What did you say, Dina? You have no relationship with this person. 3 years. He was an apostle. But he's saying, I don't know this man. But that word, the word for know here that Mark uses here, it's that awareness word. It's not the relationship or experience word you've heard me talking about. It's the awareness word. He's going so far as to claim, I don't even know who Jesus is. That's how far he's going in this denial that he's doing. But he's lying, of course. He's simply denying relationship and saying, I don't even know who this is. Questions or comments on 71? It's what fear will drive you to do. It's what pressure will drive you to do. Anything else on 71? Go ahead.
We should remember, too, he was the only one that was there.
That's true.
I mean, the rest were far from there.
Right.
So he was more courageous than the rest of them.
That's true.
Even though we've been through what he said and did, I mean, he was there.
Right. We know from the arrest story all the others have scattered. Now, the exception to that, because of things we learn in John's gospel, might be John. John might be in the house with Jesus. And again, one reason we might be able to assume that is because John followed Jesus all the way to the cross, where he's with Jesus' mother. Mother, behold your son, that story. But, yeah, I'm not saying you're wrong, Don. But Don's right. Everybody else except Peter and possibly John have scattered. Right.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, they could have strung him up too, so to speak.
Right.
Because it is a mob. There's nothing legal, if you want to say legal, about this. What else is going on now?
Well, yeah, and that's another study, how Jesus' trial was completely illegal. It doesn't mention it here, but we know she was somewhere because she's, again, as I mentioned earlier, she's at the cross, at the crucifixion scene. So she's probably watching all these things transpire, but that Mark doesn't include that in this particular story. Anything else on 71? So we reach 72. What happens? A second time. Now, when we say a second time, what does that imply? There was a first time. So at some point during this series of events, a rooster had crowed at least one time. But the first time didn't really faze Peter. Verse
68, at the end of it, whenever he went to the gateway, it says, and the rooster crowed.
You know what? I'm seeing that footnote in my Bible too. It's in some manuscripts it says and a rooster crowed, but I don't have it directly in my text.
I don't either.
So, yeah. But it's in yours?
We're beginning to expect that. We need to
I guess I got to start reading out of the New King James, start preaching from it. But yes, but now the rooster crowed a second time. First time didn't seem to faze Peter, but now the second time. What happens now? He remembered. What did he remember? What Jesus had said. And what did he say? Or a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Peter remembers this after hearing the second crow, and what does he begin to do? To weep. Why did he weep? That's it. What Jesus had said to Peter was in response to Peter saying, other people will fall away, Jesus, but I will never fall away. I will die with you. Jesus said, no, you won't. Here's what's really going to happen. It's happened. Peter begins to weep. But why did this all cause him to weep? He was in survival mode. His commitment was not what he thought it was. Yeah, when he made that statement, it was all wholeheartedly that he said that. But now all this has happened, and his commitment wavered. And he doesn't like that. I've never been in this extreme of a situation, but my commitment to Jesus, I've been in situations where my commitment has wavered. And I'm almost crying just thinking about it. But that's the situation Peter was in. His commitment wavered, and he didn't like it. He begins to weep. Now, just as a side note, you put him alongside Judas. Judas was remorseful, but he committed suicide. He didn't come back. Peter did. But that's a separate point. But this is denial number 3. Peter denied knowing Jesus. He denied knowing who Jesus was. And what Mark has also shown is that since this was Peter's 3rd time denying Jesus, what Jesus said came true. Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter begins to weep because he realizes that his commitment was not as strong as he thought it was. And taking that one step further, he realizes Jesus knew that was true, that his commitment is not what he thought it was. So when we consider everything that Mark has recorded in verses 66 through 72, the point is simply that Peter denied Jesus. He denied being with Jesus, he denied being a follower of Jesus, and he denied knowing Jesus. It's possible for us to deny Jesus. What are some situations that might cause us to deny Jesus? Being around non-believers, that might be one. Others? Okay. That goes back to being around non-believers, but being around false teaching might deny Jesus. Any other situations? Okay. Well, let's think of, there's some others I'd like to submit to you. There's some that involve others where we're being pressured to deny our relationship with Him. But another way we might be denied Jesus is when we're pressured by our own temptations and our own sins. A third way denial might come is through the pressure of persecution for our faith. Peter is undergoing some persecution here. There are places in the world where persecution, as we read it in the Bible, still occurs. That might cause you to deny Jesus. But our responsibility becomes to guard against these denials of our relationship with Him by realizing that Jesus remained faithful to God even under the pressures that would lead to His crucifixion. Another way we can guard against denial is through prayer, where we lean on God and find strength to guard against denying our relationship with Jesus. Now again, this is just some application. Any other questions or comments? All right. Matt, will you close us tonight?